evening, everyone. Welcome to the very first author interaction of the 2023 NLF Reading Challenge. My name is Karthika, and I hope you are as excited as I am to be here. Before we begin the interaction, let me give you a brief introduction about the NLF Reading Challenge, followed by a few housekeeping rules for today's session. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 3-month-long reading event from July to October 2023 for students between grades 4 to 6. It runs on the competitive and the non-competitive tracks. For the challenge, students read their way through a curated set of 30 books. They discuss their reading with their friends and their guide. They log their thoughts on what they've read, and they get to interact with the authors of some of these books. The challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies, certificates of achievements, and a wonderful set of books. For today's event, please use the Q&A box to type out your questions or your responses to what's being discussed during the session. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please mention the name of your school along with your question as well. Today, we are privileged to have with us the incredibly talented author and poet A.F. Harrold. A.F. writes and performs for adults and children. His bio notes that he spends his time showing off on stage, writing poems and books otherwise, and stroking his beard because it helps to churn the ideas. He is the anthologist of many poetry collections, including Midnight Feasts. He is also the author of The Book of Not Entirely Useful Advice, the Fizzlebird Stump series, the Greta Zargo duology, and the Philip Carnegie and Kate Greenaway Medal long-listed The Imaginary, which we have right here, and The Afterwards, as well as The Song from Somewhere Else. Today, he's here to speak with us about his tightly plotted, gorgeously illustrated, dark fairy tale of a book that's on our reading list, The Worlds We Leave Behind. Welcome, AF. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Hello, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's brilliant. Thank you for having the book on the list.
It's our pleasure.
I've got a copy of it here, so I don't need to borrow my copy from your library. So your students, they can get their copy from the library because I've not stolen it. So all is good.
Thank you so much, AF.
Would you like me to begin by reading a little bit from the book to give us a little bit of the flavour of what's going on?
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to just read the first couple of pages of the book. And it begins on Monday. Oh, that's back to front. Monday. Hex wasn't enshrined. I will begin by putting my teeth in. Hex wasn't entirely sure how the girl had come to be hurt. That morning, he and Tomo had got on their bikes and they'd headed over the level crossing and down the hill, down to the woods. On a map, the woods were a fat finger pointing away from town. A brook ran through the middle and the trees formed a gap a couple of 100 meters wide on either side, but dwindling and narrowing, closing in and petering out the further you went. Beyond them, on the left, was the road that led off to the next town. Beyond them on the right were wide, flat farmers' fields. It wasn't big enough to get lost in, but it was big enough to forget yourself in. The trees towered over you, little specks of blue twinkling high above like stars in the night sky, saying nothing. As smoke and squeals had poured off Hex and Tomo's brake pads at the bottom of the last road, they had seen the girl in her front garden. She was some years younger than they were, down at the bottom of the school, probably still in their infants, while they were up at the top. She was called Sasha something or other, and had been sat on the lawn of her front garden, pretending to read from a book to her toys. Pretending only because Hex couldn't believe the story was actually in the book, which looked like one about tractors. There was a prince who killed a giant, the girl had said. And he got sent to prison because killing is wrong. And when he was in prison, he fell in love with the prison boss's daughter, but she wouldn't marry him because he killed a giant and killing is wrong. But he said the giant was going to eat the king. And she said, well, the king should be more careful. And she married an apple and ate it all up and lived happily ever after. The end. The front door had been open a crack, and they'd heard distant voices somewhere inside. She'd lowered her book and looked at them, squinting at the sun and shading her eyes with her hand. "What you doing?" she'd asked. "Nothing," they said. And she'd asked again, and so they told her they were going into the woods. There was a rope swing set up on the high bank over the brook. It was a good place to spend a hot day. "I'll come," she said, putting a plastic horse between the pages of her book and laying it down carefully on the grass. "Nah," they'd said. But she just stood up and brushed her bottom with both hands. She sniffed her palms and said, "Don't you love that fresh smell?" She'd probably meant the grass, but it was still weird. Tomo and Hex had looked at one another at that point, a half chuckle, nervous and uncertain. "Nah, you're okay," they'd said, shaking their heads. Pulling their bikes up, they'd walked off, not looking back. And she had followed them. They hadn't invited her, hadn't forced her, hadn't encouraged her, hadn't wanted her to come. But there she was, a little kid, suddenly in their care. And now they were in the woods, and it had all gone wrong. I think I'll pause there at the bottom of page 6. So that is the introduction to the story. A girl follows some boys into the woods and it goes wrong. Who knows what happens next?
That's quite a hook for in between the first chapter. I'm sure the students who've read it and who are on this webinar couldn't wait to get to see what happened next. One of the things that we thought we'd start by asking you, AF, and viewers, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box and we'll ask them to AF as and when they come in. So a quality that we've seen, it just flows really organically in your writing, AF, is that you tend to embody thoughts or feelings like they're living entities. Like when you've written, thinking got you into trouble. One thought led to another. And when the first thought was a bad thought, the next one would look at it and shrink away or ruck its shoulders and try to be even worse. And this quality comes through so organically. And we know that your writing is also described as lyrical prose. Do you feel like this happens because that it makes its way into your prose because of your work with poetry?
I think it just seems to me to be a natural way to think of the world or to describe the world. Maybe it's a sort of natural animism, this sort of belief that every rock, every tree has a spirit in it, taken in a sort of modern secular way, give voice to things that might not otherwise get a chance to say what's going on. And so maybe it does come from poetry. As you know, I spent maybe 20 years writing poems before I wrote my first children's book, storybook at all. So I spent a lot of time thinking in poetry. And of course, in poetry, you're often giving voice to a glove or a hand or a thought. And maybe it's a way of engaging with the world as well, isn't it? To not just treat things as objects, but to embrace the multiplicity of things. I think of an author like Russell Hoban, who wrote lots of wonderful books for grown-ups and wrote this marvelous book for kids, The Mouse and His Child. And Russell Hoban was very, very vocal in giving literal voice to the objects and the things going on around. And I think I stole from him in The Song from Somewhere Else, which is the book that sort of comes before this one, where the main character, Frank, has long conversations with her stomach that has a voice of its own there. And so, yeah, let's talk with the world and find out what it has to say to us. So the answer to your question is yes, it's probably from poetry.
Thank you for that, AF. That was excellent. I'm sure there's a bunch of readers who are quickly looking up Russell Hoban to try and see if they can get their hands on the book. Let's move into some audience questions. We have a question for you from Aparna Tirthapura from NAFL Bangalore, who asks, if Mrs. was actually a parasite, why was she acting so nice at first? How could she resist acting bad?
So Mrs., who is, the thing about a parasite is it needs to get at you first. It needs to find a way in. A mosquito needs to, or a wasp needs to lay its eggs into the caterpillar first. And it might do this by stinging the caterpillar and paralyzing it and injecting its eggs so that when they grow, they eat the caterpillar from the inside out, because nature is horrible a lot of the time, especially when it comes to parasitic wasps. But it also might get its claws into you by being nice, by tempting you. And then when you're lulled in, then it'll get you. It doesn't seem to me to be an unusual behavior. The false sense of security, that's what they call it, isn't it? The being nice and then turning nasty. But she's just trying to live. Also, this is the other thing about parasites. They're just trying to live how they can. It's not their fault that other people get hurt along the way. So I have sympathy for all sides in this situation.
I'm sure that answers Aparna's question sufficiently.
Thank you.
I'm sure she's very pleased with it. Our next question, AF, and which I guess my question would sort of answer that a little bit.
Yeah.
So Sauparno asks, what inspired you to write this story, and did you take inspiration for the characters? And the question that I have for you is that you've written about how the first real idea that you had for the book came once you knew that Hector was going to be a main character. It was going to be set in the same universe as the song from somewhere else. You've also talked about, and this is great advice for young writers or writers of any age, that you've talked about how what you need is a moment. And so it hit you that in this book that you want to write, or in the story that you want to write, it would be nice to have some blank pages in the middle, ideally about 8 of them, and they will slowly sort of fade from black to white. And so if you can build your character to that moment, what happens before these blank pages and what happens after, then that's a story that you can work yourself to. That's one part of the question. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Well, to answer those two bits, our student question and your question, where the inspiration came from? I had written this book, The Song from Somewhere Else, that you've mentioned already. That was illustrated by an amazing illustrator, Levi Pinfold, who lives closer to you than he does to me. He lives in Australia there. So you're probably maybe halfway on his journey back to England. And I'd written this book, and Levi had illustrated it, and people had said nice things about it. And it had been shortlisted for the great Kate Greenaway for his illustrations. And a few years later, I was trying to think of what to write next. I'd written The Afterwards, which Emily Gravett had illustrated. And I was kind of at a loose end, not knowing where to go from that book. The Afterwards is a book about death and a journey into the afterworld. And it talks about some very big sort of issues there, mortality at the very, how do you follow that up? I thought, and then one day I realized if I took the main character's little brother, so the main character in Song from Somewhere Else, a girl called Frank, her little brother, who has a sort of bit part in that book, a boy called Hector. If I took him maybe 5 or 6 years later, when he's now Frank's age, and put him into similar situations to those that Frank had been in, she has interactions with bullies in that book. She finds a new friend who's got a supernatural secret in his basement. If I put Hector into similar situations, how would he behave? Because he's a different person. How would he respond to that? And so that was my start. Suddenly I had this character that I already knew, so I could take him along. I didn't have to invent from whole cloth. I didn't have to start afresh. And I thought about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the television series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There was a character in there, Anya, who was a vengeance demon. She ends up on the good guy's side, but she begins as a vengeance demon who, when people want revenge, when people are looking to get their own back, she sort of comes out and goes, ha, 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 I'll help you. I thought, what if I had a vengeance demon of my own? And so Mrs. and her dog Leafy were born from that. And so I needed to give Hector a reason to get involved with the vengeance demon. So we needed some bullies, we needed confrontation. And the whole thing sort of snowballed out of those ideas tumbling together. And for me, that's how it worked. For other people, they write books in different ways. Other people sit down and they come up with a whole plot and they plot it out chapter by chapter. I'm much more, let's see what happens, because I don't know what's on the next page a lot of the time. And of course, after you write a book that way, sort of stumbling forward step by step, page by page, you make a lot of mistakes and you have to spend a lot of time rewriting and honing and whittling it down into a story that makes sense and that people will want to read. But I need to stumble forwards in order to get to that place. And so the advantage that I had, knowing I was writing about Hector, following up this book, was that I knew I was writing a book for Levi to illustrate. And the images that Levi draws are such beautiful, dark, shadowy, this use of black and white in these books, in his art, just the chiaroscuro, as we would say if we were Renaissance scholars, meant that as I was writing, I also got to ask myself the question, what do I want to see Levi draw? What do I think Levi would enjoy drawing? And so that took me into the forest, into the woods. There's one big tree in the Song from Somewhere Else. I wanted more trees. Levi won the Kate Greenaway Medal for a book called Black Dog. So I thought he did a really good dog in that. So let's bring a dog into this. And so Mrs.'s companion Leafy became this dog. So it was thinking all these sorts of thoughts, not just how does the story go, but how's it going to look, that ended up being the story we've got there. So there's an answer. That's where the inspiration came.
Great, wonderful.
Wherever I just said.
Yeah, I think it also answered a little bit of Ziva Sama's question about how you thought about the illustrations, and so you've answered that through your response. Okay. We have a few Sasha fans in the audience, looks like. We have...
Well, you'll be Sasha fans. For those who haven't read the book, Sasha is the little girl who sort of kicks all the trouble off. Anyways, Sasha fans will be happy to know, perhaps, that I've written a third book for Levi Pinfold that is sat on my editor's desk at the moment, in which Sasha is the main character. So in 4 or 5 years' time, and Levi has done the drawings, he's very popular, so it's going to be a while. There will be, hopefully, fingers crossed, a Sasha-led novel for you. So watch out for that.
Absolutely.
Nobody else knows that. That was a sneak. I probably shouldn't even have said it to you guys. So keep it amongst yourselves. Don't leak that information to the wider world, please.
Done. But definitely something to look forward to. So these are the questions that have come for you from Nila, Tusha, and Amaya, who ask, even when the events keep changing, why does Sasha keep fracturing her arm? That's one. And second, from Archana Mishra, about how did you get the idea of making Sasha read out a different story from a book about tractors?
When a character like Sasha walks into your book, and characters do this sometimes, you don't have an awful lot of control over them. And so when the kids, when Hector and Tomo sort of skidded to a stop on their bikes and saw Sasha in her front garden, all I had to do is I sat at my computer, here's my keyboard here. As I sat there typing the story, I just got to listen to the story Sasha was telling and sort of look and go, oh, okay. That's what you're saying? Okay, fine. And she constantly surprises me, which is why I wanted to write a book with her as the lead. So I get to hear more of her stories there. She just seems to be the sort of girl who can look at a book about tractors and instead of reading out, John Deere, 1947, 600 horsepower, find a story about apples and giants and things in there. That's just the sort of girl she is. And she walked in and I didn't know her until I listened to her. And why does she keep breaking her arm? I wanted, maybe with my sort of thinking writer's hat on, actually sort of thinking about things, maybe I wanted something in each of the worlds to be the same, to be a sort of point of coherence, of consistency there, to maybe put in, maybe in the reader's mind, maybe in the universe's mind, the idea of fate. Maybe some things are just meant to happen. Maybe Sasha's just got a particularly fragile arm. But I like that idea of something being the same while everything around it changes. It just feels, when you're writing poems, when you're writing poetry, sometimes you write rhyming poems. You know this, you know what poems sound like. Sometimes poems have rhymes. Sometimes poems just have assonance, just sounds that are similar. Sometimes they have alliteration where the beginnings of the words have the same sound. There are these patterns that you find as you write poems. Even when you write free verse, when you're not writing rhyming poems, you're still in your mind, you've got the idea of rhythm in there, the idea of repeating words or repeating images sort of running through the poem to link it all together. And so maybe the broken arm comes also like the personification comes from this sort of poetic feeling that I have for telling the story. Maybe that sort of rhyming element. And of course, there's a lot more rhyming elements between Hex's life and Tomo's life and the way they look at things in the two worlds of the book. There's a lot of chiming, rhyming, assonantal writing in there. And so maybe the broken arm is just the most obvious of those.
Excellent. That's a very thoughtful answer to that question. Thank you for
that.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a thoughtful question. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
guys.
Sasha fans in there. So I think we're almost out of time. So we'll get to our last question for you, AF, which is more about you, the person, than you, the writer, which has just come in from our audience member, from Ayan Pansuria, who asks, how does it work if you're a poet, an author, and a comedian? Do you prioritize one over the other? If so, what do you prioritize?
You have to do different things at different times. I think that's the sort of most obvious answer there. I came to all this being a children's writer from being a performance poet. This is where my roots are. Performance poetry, slam poetry, comedy poetry. So live on stage in front of an audience, making them laugh with poems and with jokes in comedy clubs and cabaret nights and all that sort of thing. One day I realized it's difficult to make a living as a poet doing that. And so I got involved with doing some school workshops because people will pay you to run poetry workshops. And so that led to me writing poems for kids, and that led to me working more with kids, and that led to writing stories for kids. So it's the performance and the comedy that came first. I've written funny stories for kids. My first books, the Fizzlebert Stump series, were a comedy series. And then I wrote The Imaginary, which was kind of darker, a little bit stranger, not a comedy. And so I write these different sorts of things. And I hope there's a little bit of sort of moments of comedy maybe in here, but it is a serious book. It is talking about and thinking about serious things. But then I go out and I talk to an audience about a serious book, but I can only make jokes when I do it because that's what I do. But then you have to stand in front of an audience and suddenly turn from comedy into talking about loss or grief or bullying or the other things that happen in these books. And audiences are brilliant. Audiences are amazing, especially I visit a lot of schools. So often in a school hall in front of a couple of hundred kids, we've been doing funny poems. And then I have to talk about something dark, strange, about death, about loss, about grief. And kids are amazing that they can just turn and they can give you their attention. They know, okay, we've had some jokes. This is a bit serious. And then we can have a joke a bit later on. But kids are smart enough to be able to turn with me from comedy to tragedy, to seriousness, to poetry, to being silly. And they give me a great hope for the future, the kids I meet, in their empathy and their enthusiasm for being better people than the adults that are running the world at the moment. And so that's a hopeful thing to sort of go towards the end on. There was something of an answer in that, so I hope that helps. But I wear many hats, and sometimes you have to wear two at the same time, and sometimes you just keep one on. There we go.
That was a wonderful answer and a wonderful note for us to end our session on, AF.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
It's absolutely been my pleasure. Thank you, Karthika.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing all of your new work.
Thank you. Thank you. And anyone who does read this during your summer reading challenge, it's a strange book, and good luck with it. And it may not be everyone's cup of tea, and that is absolutely fine. It's an important thing about books and about reading. They may not all be for you, and you're allowed to go, okay, that wasn't me, because you will pick up another book that goes, I'm yours. This is what you're about. And some of you will have that feeling with this, and some of you will have it with other books. But books are brilliant. Good luck exploring them all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, AF.
I'll leave now. I'll leave you to talk about me behind my back. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop the video. Here we go. Cheerio.